So here it's warning us that the entry point function is not present in the source code, which is true because I just deleted it. This entry point is basically telling Google Cloud which function is going to get called once we hit the API endpoint that this is going to be connected to. So basically the function that will start running our cloud function. So I'm going to leave this as it is right now. And in our index file, what we're going to do is basically call, receive, first of all, the user input from the addin. So whatever prompt the user sent is going to be received here. And then we're going to send that to Claude, which is the AI model that we'll be using. Claude is the competition of OpenAI's GPT-4. It's developed by a different company called Anthropic. We've been experimenting with it a bit, so we're gonna be trying that out today. And we're gonna pass the user prompt to Claude saying we need code to execute this in Revit. So it's gonna give us the code. We're gonna clean it up and send it as the answer, as the response of this endpoint. So that's going to be the overall functionality that we'll cover here. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to import some stuff that we need using require. Basically, we need .env, which is a library you probably, if you coded before, you probably know it. It's what we're going to use to access some environment variables that we're going to have in our code, some data that we need that it's not going to be hard-coded. So here, we're not going to build the entire functionality in our index file. We're going to import another file that will have some of the functionality. So we're going to create an ask Zoidberg function, which is going to be in a separate file. So we're going to import it here. We haven't created this yet. We'll do that in a second. And now we're going to create an export for our main function that we're going to call once we hit this endpoint. So we're gonna use the usual format that we use for this. It's gonna be an arrow function. First thing we will need is an API key that we're gonna send as authentication. So basically here is where we will check if the user has an API key to call this endpoint to prevent everyone from just calling this openly and just drying out our credits with Anthropic or Google Cloud. So we're going to make sure that the user sent that API key. And we're going to look for it in the request header. So we're gonna look for this header. Sorry, I need square brackets here. Since this will be something we will look for as an object. Sorry about that. This could also be, we're gonna allow the user to send it in the header or as a query parameter. So we're gonna look for it in the two places, in the request headers or in the query parameters. So here, if the API key isn't present, we're gonna just return. So if the API key is null or it's different than the API key that we have stored, we're gonna explain that in a second. we're gonna send a 401 unauthorized exception with a 401 code, and we're gonna send an object saying error unauthorized. Sorry about that. So we're gonna return here. Okay. What we just did here is we are checking for the API key. And if it's null or if it's different than the API key that we have stored, and this is where we need .env, because we're gonna be reading this from the environment variables of our cloud function, it's gonna return with a 401 status code saying unauthorized. So now we do have our entry point function. It's called Zoidberg Assistant. So I'm gonna fill that out right here as Zoidberg Assistant. So right now, whenever anyone calls our HTTPS endpoint, it's gonna start running here. So this will be our entry point. Right now, the only thing we're doing is checking our API key and returning if it's not present. So we're gonna start with the actual functionality now. So first thing we're gonna do is a try catch block. So this will try to execute our code here, and if something fails, we'll send the user an error. So we're gonna create a variable to store the user instruction, the prompt that our user gave us. That is also gonna be in our query parameters. So we're gonna call it instruction. So we're gonna look for an instruction variable or parameter inside our query object inside the request sent by the user. So if that's not present here, we're gonna return a 400 error. And we're gonna send an object here similar to what we did up here. It's basically a bad request status, and we're gonna say error. Please provide an instruction for Zoidberg in your query parameters. So this will instruct anyone that wants to use our function that they need to send an instruction for this to work. If they don't send any instruction, then we don't have much to do here. So we'll have an answer here, and we're gonna await for an ask Zoidberg function that will receive our user instruction here. So, and if this runs, it's gonna send a 200 status, which is successful status, and it's gonna return our answer here. So just to catch up here, we're looking for a user instruction. If this fails, we're gonna fall out here to sending a bad request error, asking for an instruction in the query parameters. We're gonna pass the user instruction to an ask Zoidberg function. Remember, we are importing that from a different file that we will create just to separate our code's responsibilities here. And that Zoidberg function, ask Zoidberg function, is gonna give us an answer that we will return in the end. So this is gonna be our successful run, our happy path for the user. they should receive our answer, which will be the code to run the action in Revit, because remember, this will interact with our addin that will develop afterwards. So if something here fails, we're going to catch that error and we're going to log it to the console as an error. So we're going to say error, and we're going to pass it the error here. And we're going to send a 500 status, which means there was an internal server error with our backend code. And again, we're going to send that in our response to the user or the addin in this case, saying an error occurred. Okay, so we have our entry point function ready to go. There's an important comment here. It's not ideal to work directly in the Cloud Function UI here because we can't actually save this. You see, save function is not supported. Like I said, I will provide the code as a local repo for you to run in VS Code if you want, and to actually deploy automatically to Cloud Functions every time something is merged to main. Just to keep the tutorial simple, I will keep coding here, but I will give you the other version to run locally. If you prefer to follow along with that, feel free to do it. All right, so we have our index, our entry point function here fully set up. Now we need to build the ask Zoidberg function. So I'm going to add a file, ask Zoidberg.js. Remember, we are importing that right here. We need to create this function now. So let's start with that part. Basically, what this function will do is receive the user prompt that we're passing it right here in line 14. And it will send that to the AI model, clean it up, and return it. So that's gonna be the responsibility that this function will have. So first part will be sending our prompt to Claude. That is a separate responsibility, so we're gonna do that in another file. So I'm gonna start by importing a send to Claude function that we will create afterwards. And we're gonna do the same we just did in our index file. I'm gonna import that. So I'm gonna create an async function, an async function called ask Zoidberg, which is the one we are importing in our index file. And we're gonna pass it a user question. So this will be our main instruction, our main prompt. We're gonna open up the function and we're gonna do, yep, you guessed it, a try catch block. And we will use our prompt so we're gonna tell Claude that this is our user request, and we're gonna pass in our prompt here. So, and yeah, I have an error here. I'm not using backticks. We need to use template literal here. There we go. So using backticks, I can interpolate this variable right here. So this is our prompt. this is what we are gonna pass to Claude, saying, hey, the user wants to do this, give me the code to do it. So we're gonna receive code from Claude. So remember, we are gonna create this function later and send to Claude. We'll actually send it our prompt, which will be this string plus the user instruction. And yeah, after that, we're gonna return the code. So this will be our very simple ask Zoidberg function. But yeah, we're missing a catch block here. So any errors we have, again, we'll catch them here. And we're gonna say an error occurred in ask Zoidberg. So we're gonna be a bit more specific here with where the error happened. This is not ideal error handling by any means, but it will do for the purposes of this tutorial. And we're gonna throw that error. So this function is wrapped in a try catch here. So if it throws an error, we're gonna actually catch it here, but yeah. We're gonna have everything in our logs, in our Cloud Function logs. So that should be useful. And right now, our last step is to export this model as Zoidberg. Okay, so we're exporting this and importing it right here. All right, now we're gonna build the send to Claude function. Actually, yeah, let's be a bit more specific here. We're gonna add the extension of the file right here at the top, and we're gonna create this function. So first step, again, we're gonna create the file, send to Claude. We're gonna switch to it. The UI with Cloud Functions can be a little buggy, so if you see it doesn't refresh, just switch the file back and forth. That should fix it. So what we're gonna do here, we're gonna need to use the Anthropic SDK. So we're gonna have to import that as well. But before that, we just want to make sure that this thing is running. So far, as expected, we've advanced a little and we haven't tested anything yet. We haven't deployed this yet. So I just want to make sure that everything's working up to this point. So we're going to just create the function here, send to Claude, which will receive a prompt as a parameter. So we're going to open that up. We're going to just say return and return a simple string. It looks like this worked so far. And now we're gonna say module exports send to Claude. So just to recap, our entry point Zoidberg Assistant is gonna call, first of all, check if we have an API key here, and it's gonna call our ask Zoidberg function that we're importing from this file. Ask Zoidberg will call this send to Claude function and return the response that it gets from it. And for now, our send to Claude function is just returning a string. So we should see this as a response in our Cloud function if we try running it. There's a couple things missing and we still don't have this API key. So this environment variable is not present. Also, in our package.json, we need to import or actually install these modules that we're importing so that when our Cloud function environment is set up by Google, it installs the required libraries. So we're gonna take a look here at our package.json. So we're gonna have to add a couple dependencies here. For example, .env. We're gonna just copy that from the, you can just copy these from the repo if that's easier for you, but we're gonna be installing .env for now in our dependencies, because that's one dependency that we are using right now. I think it's the only one. We're gonna have to add several others later. We're gonna also give this a name, which will be Zoidberg AI tutorial, and our version is gonna be 0.0.1, and yeah, that will be all for now for our initial deployment. So I'm gonna click on deploy. I'm gonna wait for this to finish. This could take a few seconds. So you might get an error here. I just got this one. Provided module can be loaded. Cannot find module. Ask Zoidberg.js. So we're gonna edit and redeploy and see what's going on. So here's where we're importing Ask Zoidberg, and I see there's some missing dot here. So that was probably it. My bad. Sorry about that. I think that this should be the relative path to this file. So let's try again. Also, it's important to select first gen when you're initially setting up your function. I forgot to mention that at the beginning. I will leave a note so that you don't get any errors related to that, because we'll be using first generation Google Cloud functions here. And let's see if it deployed successfully now. Okay, we got another error while deploying. Provided module can't be loaded. Is there a syntax error in your code? Module.exports is not a function. Send to cloud line 5. And we are on the latest file we were editing, which is sent to cloud. And here, yeah, we're using exports like this. And here, for some reason, I did it in a different way. Instead of just assigning the export to the function, I was passing it as a function. So as a function parameter. So that was probably the error. We're gonna save and redeploy and see how it goes. And now we're ready. Our function is successfully deployed. So our next step is to try this out. The way we're gonna do that is we're gonna go to trigger, and this is very important. This is the URL that we'll use to call our function. So we're gonna use that in a second, but first, if you remember, we included an environment variable right here, and this isn't set up. So we're gonna get an error if we try to execute our function right now. What we need to do is to create the API key and save it as an environment variable right here, so that we can use that for authentication in our endpoint. So we're gonna go to open a new tab here, Google Cloud, and I'm gonna go to credentials. This one should be it, and we have an API keys section right there. And we're gonna go to create credentials, API key, and we're gonna wait for this to be done. So we have an API key right here that we can use with our application. We're gonna copy it, make sure to keep this safe, and we're gonna, yeah, it's warning us that this API key is unrestricted, so it doesn't have any actual permissions set. It's just free for all. So it's not ideal. Just make sure to keep it safe and to correctly set your permissions in your project. For this tutorial project, I'm going to leave it as is. And I'm going to go back to our function. We know it's being deployed, so it's building successfully and everything seems to be working. So right now I'm going to go to edit and I'm going to go to, this edit up here. And we need to go to environment variables. So basically, we need to expose our API key as a secret and an environment variable. So we're going to go to security and image repo, and we're going to go to add a secret reference. So, okay, we can create a new secret because the secret manager API must be enabled. So this is one of the things that we need to enable before we continue. Just a second here. Enable APIs and services. And we're going to go to enable APIs and services, and we're going to look for secret manager API. Okay, here it is. So we're going to enable this API. And we're going to wait for that to be finished. It looks like it's activated. Yep. Should be good to go. Let me refresh here. Okay, we're gonna go back here. And now the create new secret option should be available. So let me move this over. Name. So we will call this endpoint API key. Secret value will be the key which is copied, and we're gonna create it. We're gonna grant the service account permissions, and we're gonna set this path to endpoint API key latest. So this secret reference will be stored as an environment variable in our project, and it will always point to the latest version of that secret. So if we go back later and update that secret, this will automatically point to the latest version. And sorry, we need to select exposed as environment variable here, and this will be endpoint API key and latest, so that it always points to the latest version of that secret, like I just said. And this should store the secret in that environment variable. So if you remember, in our code, we are looking for it with that name. So we should be good to go. Let's redeploy that with the environment variable set. Let's wait for it to finish. So our function is again successfully deployed. We're going to go to variables, and we should see under secrets our endpoint API key secret exposed as an environment variable here. So it should be pointing to the secret path and the latest version of that secret. So this environment variable will always point to our latest deployment of that secret in our project. So now we're ready to test it. We're going to go to trigger, and we're going to copy our endpoint right here. So this will be our trigger URL. Now we're going to use Postman to hit this endpoint and actually check if our code is running successfully. So I'm going to create a new collection here, blank collection called Zoidberg AI tutorial. And I'm gonna add a request. Default endpoint right here, and my URL will be our URL that we just copied. Now we need to set an authorization here. We can set it at the folder level, and we're gonna use an API key here. So if you remember, in our code, we are establishing that the API key should be a header called XAPI key or a query parameter called API key. So I'm going to use the header option right here. I'm going to copy that. The key will be XAPI key, and the value should be our API key in our secret right here. We just we had it right there, and we're gonna view the secret value and copy that. Go back to Postman, and that's gonna be our API key value that we're gonna add to the header. So right now in our request, the authorization should be inherit auth from parent, which is what we just set. I'm gonna save that, and we're gonna try that. Okay, we're getting a forbidden error that is telling us that our client does not have permission to get this URL. So let's go back to our function here. Let's look at the permissions, and it looks like this function isn't open to the public. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to grant access, and we're gonna write all users here. This means everyone will be able to do the actions that we said here. So in select the role, we're gonna go to cloud functions and cloud functions invoker. So this means anyone will be able to invoke our cloud function, which is what we want. Let's click on allow public access, and we should be good to go. Let's go back to Postman here and try it again. Awesome. So we're getting an error saying, please provide an instruction for Zoidberg in your query parameters, which is exactly what we want. We didn't include an instruction query parameter here. So we're gonna add anything here as instruction, and it looks like this worked so far. So we have successfully built and deployed our cloud function that we are able to call using an API key that we defined so that it's not fully open to anyone. So congrats if you're following along so far. So now that we know that our function is working, our code is running on the cloud and everything, we can proceed to build our functionality to send our prompt to Claude. Right now, we're just providing a default string, a hard-coded string here, which is not what we need. Let's go and keep editing our code here. So first thing we're gonna do, going back to our send-to-Claude.js file, is import the Anthropic SDK right here. So we're gonna import the Anthropic object from the Anthropic SDK. /SDK. This is how you import their SDK to your code. And And once again, we're gonna use .env. About that. Right here, because we're gonna have to add an Anthropic API key that we're gonna have to generate with Anthropic to use and access the Anthropic API. So now that we have our imports set up here, we are ready. Yeah, I'm used to saving everything all the time. I can't do that here. So I'm gonna get rid of our hard-coded string, and we're gonna build our actual functionality here. We're gonna start by defining an Anthropic constant variable here, and we're gonna instantiate an Anthropic object, and for that we need to pass in an environment variable to the constructor here. So again, a key. So that's what we need here, an Anthropic API key to work with the Anthropic SDK. Right there, I don't have a linter here, which is pretty annoying. So now that we have our instance of the Anthropic object, you can check their documentation too for more details into that, but we're gonna write another try-catch block here. And what we need here is a response that we're gonna store in this variable that we are gonna get from the messages API from Anthropic. So here we're gonna create a message, and this needs us to pass in an object. That object will be structured as follows. We're gonna pass in a model here. We can also store that in an environment variable. So in the future, we can store that as a variable and change the model that we're using, the AI model that we're using, without changing our code. So Anthropic model will be an environment variable. We're gonna pass another parameter here to our object. This is the max tokens that we're gonna use. Right here, the maximum token window for the model we're gonna use is 4096. So we're gonna use that. Temperature is gonna be 0 for now. And here we have a really important part. We're gonna pass in a system message. So most of these LLMs, these types of AI models, they use a system message for the model to know the role that it has to assume. So we have two types of messages, actually three types: system, user, and assistant or AI model. The system message tells the AI model what role it needs to assume. Then you have user messages, which are user-generated messages, which we're gonna generate in a second. And then we have the messages that the AI generates as a response to our message, our user message. So our system prompt will be, we will explain it, the context of what it needs to do. So we're gonna say you're Zoidberg, an expert in AC technology and BIM development. That helps with Revit requests. When you receive a message, we need to tell it that we don't need explanations or instructions on how to do the action. We need actual Python code to execute that action. We're going to try to execute that code directly in our addin. So you receive a message. We're going to tell it to reply with Python free code to execute the action described. In the Revit API, we're going to tell it what technologies to use. We're going to use C, Python, and the Revit Python wrapper. So I'm going to give you context on the C Python part. When we move to the front-end side, the addin, you will see why we're using C Python there. We're going to tell it to not add anything that is in code, formatting, markdown, extra spaces, or explanations. The code needs to run directly in Revit. If there's something to report back to the user, code, it's gonna tell it to produce code to be ready to run in Revit. And if there's something that we need to tell the user, like, hey, the total count of windows that you requested is 32, we're gonna tell it to code a pop-up window with that information. Put it into a pop-up window in Revit. Don't print anything to the console because we're not gonna be able to read it. What else can we say? Don't use external libraries outside of the standard Revit API and Revit Python wrapper. And we're gonna also give it because sometimes this is gonna need to produce code that uses the Revit UI application or the Revit document to execute actions. We're gonna need to pass those as variables in the Python engine that is gonna be running in our addin. I know that can sound complicated, just bear with me. It's gonna be clear when we go to the front end side, but basically we're gonna tell it if you need to use the Revit application or document in code variables, they should be available, or they gonna be assertive here. They will be available as app. Sorry, I'm gonna use single quotes here to avoid breaking the string, as app and doc. So we're gonna give it the Revit app as an app variable and the document as a doc variable. So it should always access those variables with those names. Otherwise, they're not gonna be available. And we're gonna tell it to start a transaction in the Revit document if you need to modify it, because we're gonna run this outside transactions, because sometimes the AI will generate code that opens a transaction with the Revit API, and we're gonna get an error saying you can't open a transaction inside another transaction that hasn't closed. So that's why we are doing this. And we can keep modifying this as we test it later when we go to the addin part. So Here, our last parameter that we need to pass in is a messages object that it actually is an array that will contain objects that represent messages. So our only message here will be, we're going to start an array with an object inside, and our single message here will be role user. Remember the roles that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And the content will be the prompt. And that's all. That's all we need for the Anthropic API to run. And we're gonna log the response to the console because we're gonna be able to access those logs right here under the logs tab. So we're generating a messages object with this object here that contains an array of messages and a system prompt. So our only message in that array will be of role user, and it will contain the prompt that we're passing in here. So after we await for this API called this Anthropic SDK method to finish, we're gonna return the output of that. So we're gonna say return response dot content. It will be an array of content, so we need the first object in that array, and we're gonna access the text in that array. So this is gonna be the result of this whole thing running. And as always, an error happens, we're gonna catch it here, and we're gonna log that as an error to the console. And we're gonna say that there was an error sending the message, and we're gonna throw that error. We already have our export here, so we should be good to call this from our endpoint. But we're still missing one component, that is the Anthropic API key here. So at this point, we're gonna go ahead and generate an API key for us to interact with the Anthropic API. So I'm gonna go to the Anthropic console. So if you go to console.anthropic.com, you can create an account for yourself using your Google account or with your email and password, and you can just go right here into the console. You get, if I'm not remembering wrong, you get $5 in credits to play with the API. So you will see this screen, and you can create an organization, and then you should go to your profile and API keys. So right here, I'm going to create a new key, Solidberg tutorial, create key, and I'm going to copy this to my clipboard. And what I'm going to do is go back to my function, and once again, I'm going to create a secret exposed as an environment variable. So if you remember, here we have our previous secret. We're going to go to edit, and right here at the bottom, security and image repo, add a secret reference, and we're going to create a new secret, and it's going to be Anthropic API key. Secret value, we're going to paste our key, and we're not going to set an expiration date. We're going to just create a secret. This secret is not accessible by our service account in this cloud function, so we're going to click on grant right here. It will automatically update our permissions to access that secret, and we're going to expose it as an environment variable. Again, it should be the latest version. Anthropic API key. This is how we are calling the variable in our code. So we should be good to go right here. We also need to add another environment variable. You remember we said Anthropic model just to avoid hard coding the model we're using in our code. So we're gonna go back to the console here, and we're gonna go to the workbench, and we're gonna use Claude 3 Opus to test. We can also use Sonnet. They are both pretty good. Sonnet is cheaper and faster. Opus is more powerful. For now, we're gonna use Opus, but you can use any of them. They are both pretty good for this purpose. So we're gonna go to get code here, and as you can see, this is an example from Claude, and this is how it's calling the model. If you remember, in our code, we're creating a message and we're passing model with our environment variable here. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to set it as the value for my environment variable. So this looks perfect. We also have the API key as a secret exposed right there. And now that we have set both those things up, we're gonna click deploy. Okay, so our deployment failed and it's saying that provided module can be loaded. Did you list all required modules in the package.json dependencies? No, I didn't. So that's the mistake. So cannot find module Anthropic AI SDK. So here in send to Claude, we are, and this looks like it falls back to the previous version. We are importing, I have a copy right here. We are importing Anthropic from this module, but I forgot to include that in our package.json. So this file, you probably know, it includes all the dependencies our code needs to run, and this is checked by Google Cloud Platform when installing the project and building the environment for a cloud function. So I didn't include the Anthropic AI SDK, so I'm gonna just copy that and paste it right in. You can copy the package.json from the repo that I'm going to provide so that it will be easier for you to follow along. Now I'm gonna save and redeploy. And this will update post deploy. So now our function deployed successfully. And now we should be ready to test it out again. But now it should actually provide us with code to do the action that we describe under our instruction. So we're going to try saying count the floors in this model. I'm going to send that. It's going to take a little longer now for everything to run because it needs to call the Anthropic API and wait for a response. So there we go. Our answer is Python code, and it looks pretty good. This import looks a bit weird because it's using that for the Revit pop-up, but anyhow, our endpoint is working as expected, so we should be ready to move to the front end part, which is going to be our C# button. Just a quick recap. What we've done so far is pretty amazing because we are giving our endpoint an instruction in natural language and it's replying with Python code to execute that action automatically in Revit. So this is pretty awesome.